But in any case, the body of the condemned begins with a famous and hideous passage, which if I read, then this tape will probably be censored. And it's about the way they killed people who committed horrible crimes. Now today, when people commit horrible crimes, they're on a current affair for 3 or 4 nights, right? 2 or 3 books are written about them. They make a movie about them like Silence of the Lambs, and then they're locked away somewhere. That's where we're moving. That's where we move to. But let's start from how we got there. The prisoner that he begins by discussing is drawn and quartered and torn apart by horses. I'll make this brief. Lava is sort of, or sulfur is poured into his wounds and set on fire. I don't need to go into detail here. You understand these medieval tortures. They're well known. The condemned man must, as it were, the priest comes up and the condemned man must make his honorable announcement before God that he understands the justice of the punishment. And of course, after the punishment's begun, this is not a hard thing to get him to do. And so the book begins with him kissing the cross and making his honorable amends, would be an English way to say it. And then they continue to torture him, and and literally on his body is written the power of the king in the church. In other words, it's literally written on his body. By the way, if you want for me to suggest another literary way to look backward at that form of punishment, remember The Penal Colony by Franz Kafka, where the machine writes literally on the body of the victims. Of course, Kafka has lived to see modernity, so the machine ends up eating its own judge, writing on the judge, "Be just," which I find among Kafka's many hilarious stories. I mean, I find them funny. I'm sorry, I'm that sick, but I find that another funny one. In any case, it starts with the body of the condemned. And the next chapter is about the spectacle of the scaffold and all of the ritual that goes along with these kind of ceremonies. When they're going to do this, you can imagine the streets of Paris. They're all abuzz. There's the spectacle, the scaffold. There are vendors. There are people that write little pamphlets about the executed. I mean, we have an American analogy to that. That's like, you know, the little Billy the Kid pamphlets that were printed up in the early West about our great criminals and so on. Foucault asked this very interesting question. What was it that fueled the interest in the criminal? Why was the criminal the star of this production, the scaffold, the spectacle of the scaffold? He's the star. Well, the crowds became unruly because in many cases the courage of the criminal would become the legend of the spectacle. The courage, the tenacity, and the bravery of the criminal would become the story. Well, reformers decided that this was not a healthy mode of punishment. Foucault cynically decides that perhaps it was not considered healthy because the wrong people were the stars of the show, not because it was too barbaric. And I think that that's not only a cynical guess, but he gives some evidence that that's the case. In any event, we know that this early history of punishment, from the Middle Ages at least, from the early sort of pre-capitalist days, this interest in criminals has continued on into the present. I mean, they still haven't found a way to discipline and punish that have totally drained us of our interest in criminals. As you know from watching any television, even if you hate it, you've got to know this. I mean, I think that Time Life now is going to put out a series of books, I'm not denouncing them for it, on criminals. But this is nothing new, right? These are things that excite us as the normal. because they break up the regime of normalcy and show it in a way for what it is. In other words, just as when the king wrote his punishment on the body of the condemned, the mute body of the prisoner, even if he said nothing, spoke volumes about the institutional rules that would put that practice in place. Well, anyway, that practice was abandoned. It's been a while since we've drawn and quartered anyone, although when you listen to some of the latest rhetoric about law and order, I don't know how much longer it will be before we'll be drawing and quartering people again. But anyway, that practice for at least the present has been abandoned. And it's replaced, according to Foucault, by what he calls generalized punishment. It's very interesting. The French word might lead us to believe that this is a sort of double word. It's not only punishment, it's potential punishment, and it's also a kind of, the word discipline would be a kind of surveillance. So what happens is that the change, if you wanted to look at it, what Foucault is writing in this book is a history of criminology in a certain way. The change here is that we move from the body of the condemned as a singular individual, Billy the Kid, to use the American example, to a generalized social body. Criminals now appear not with names, but as public enemy number one. I mean, anybody could be that. In other words, it's a general abstract role. It's across the whole of what could be called the social body. And in fact, we now see punishment, and of course, I want to make this just as cynical as it is. It's the great reformers that are responsible for this. This is the work of the liberals. I mean, the conservatives wanted to continue to draw and quarter people, but no, let's reform. The great utilitarians like Bentham, which I'll mention, whom I shall mention again later, were among the reformers that led the way in some of these areas. When punishment becomes generalized across the social body, across the whole of society, what happens is that punishment becomes something like public works. You do a small crime and you go out and you do works for the public. But like sweeping up can't be as heroic as having the king's name written on your body. In fact, it's rather degrading. It's not supposed to be something about which one can write a dime novel. Prisons become more like schools and less like these festivals of atonement. They become places where people are to be re-normalized, injected back into the social body if possible. What the reformers have done, according to Foucault, however, is not to abolish power in favor of more humanistic treatment. What they have done is to institute a microphysics of power that has control over what Foucault calls docile bodies. Power has lost its awesome grandeur, its splendor. The power now in institutions like prisons is a micro power. It's the power of observation, of being able to control movements, of being able to force prisoners into get-well programs and lie to their parole boards after having lied to therapists, after having lied to all the various people they have to lie to in order to get out. And for people who think that prisoners are being let out right and left, watch a little court TV and see how many people actually win parole. Now, in some states where they've stopped building prisons because they are tired of tax and spend, some prisoners do get out. But by and large, it's hard to get through a parole board.